Thanks everyone for joining the webinar today. My name's Henry. I'm one of the co-founders here at Reclaim. Today we'll be kind of going over basically an overview of Reclaim and really focusing on sort of the core concepts of the product as it applies to a bunch of the sort of major features that we offer. And my goal is that you kind of walk away hopefully with some new practices and tips and tricks that help you to kind of get the most out of the product. So I'll just go ahead and share my screen here. Reclaim, as some of you may know if you've tried it, is really, we think of it as sort of an intelligent calendar assistant. And what does that really mean? It means that we help you to make your calendar a reflection of the stuff that you want to get done. And we help you by basically automating away a lot of the stuff that tends to be really time consuming when it comes to basically aligning your calendar to your priorities. But one of the big challenges around time blocking is flexibility, right? It's one thing to have a robot that's kind of helping you make time for stuff, but at Reclaim, we really think about giving you a lot of control over a variety of different factors when it comes to making time for your priorities. And so that's kind of where I'm going to start, is really thinking about like, how do we give you that flexibility and what does that really mean as it applies to your calendar? And to do that, I'm going to start by actually showing you kind of one of our most popular features, which is a feature we call habits. If you've gone through our onboarding, you've probably set up these habits here, this morning catch up for email, afternoon catch up for email, and a little bit of lunch, pretty universal things that most busy professionals need. So the first layer of flexibility that I'll just call out is around prioritization, right? We really believe that if you want to be intentional about where you spend your time, you need to have control over how each of your kind of routines and tasks is prioritized. And so if I decide, for example, that lunch is the most important thing, I can just drag it to the top here, right? And this is kind of the first kind of layer of prioritization that we introduce, right? And this is basically telling Reclaim, look, I want to make sure that lunch is sort of the first thing that you look for when you're looking for time on my calendar. But if I dive into one of these, you can see kind of another layer of flexibility, which is really around the actual, what we call the time policy, but you can think of this as sort of a time window for the routine. And you can apply this to any routine, whether it's, coding or reading or networking or a weekly report or whatever it might be. But basically what you're telling Reclaim here is, obviously, here's the title of the thing. Here's kind of the category that it applies to, whether it's work or personal. You can give it a custom color if you'd like. And then, you're basically just telling us like, what's the earliest possible time that I could imagine myself feasibly doing this thing? And what's the latest possible time, right? And so in the case of lunch, this is sort of our default setting, 11 to 2. That's a pretty sane range. Some folks like to eat earlier. Some people like to eat later. It's really up to you. And generally, the more flexibility you give Reclaim, the better your experience is going to be, right? The more options you kind of give the system to think about when it's making time, the more flexibility your schedule is going to have. And so you kind of have this time window here. Duration operates the same way, right? I'm basically telling Reclaim, like, what's the lowest amount of time I could envision eating lunch? And 25 minutes is probably about the fastest I could do it without making myself sick. And then the maximum, right? But like, I don't really need more than 50 minutes. And then you're giving us a frequency. In the case of lunch, obviously, it makes sense to kind of do it, 5 times a week or probably 7 times a week if you want to block it on the weekends. But we have a bunch of different options here, right? You can choose biweekly frequencies or monthly frequencies. If I were to pick, say, like a once a week habit, you'll see this thing called ideal day appear. This is basically Reclaim saying, look, I can kind of pick anything Monday through Friday here if I'm going to do this once a week, but tell me kind of what day ideally you'd like to do it, and we'll try to get it as close to that day as possible. But since it's lunch, I'm going to make it 5 times a week. You can give us a start date if you want the habit to start later. And then this is really about visibility, and this is a theme you'll see. It's kind of another layer of flexibility that we offer is around how your events show to other people. And so we give you controls to show habits, with their full title or to just show them as busy. And I'll go into more detail on this when I go through our calendar sync section. The last thing here, and I'll probably transition into showing you what this actually looks like on the calendar here in a second. But these last options here are really about this option, time defense, is really about like how aggressively do you want us to defend this time on your calendar? And I'll come back to that in a second. But this setting is kind of one of the kind of core concepts and really sort of central parts of our platform, which is that we not only give you flexibility over when things get scheduled, we give you flexibility over how they appear to other people and whether they appear as busy or free. And we do that by sort of intelligently simulating and trying to assess how much flexibility you have in your schedule. But I'll come back to that here in a moment. Notifications, you get some controls here. If you want to add other people to the habit, you can do that here. This is a pretty nifty feature. This basically allows you to exclude certain events from being scheduled. So if I said, anytime I see the word lunch, I don't want lunch to be scheduled on that same day. So if there's another event that has the word lunch in it, we're gonna skip that. And that's basically habits, right? And so you can stack rank these things. You can kind of change the time window of them. And I kind of get this list of events here. But another kind of aspect of flexibility is we really want people to be able to work kind of where they already do, right? We have our own sort of calendar-esque interface where you can make these, make different kind of changes to these events. But we also have lots of integrations, including with Google Calendar directly. And so the first thing I'll do is actually just kind of show you how this stuff is showing up on the calendar right now. So you can kind of see we have lunch here, right? It's threading throughout the week. You've got lunch on Monday. Sometimes it's at 11, sometimes it's at 11:30, sometimes it's at 12:15, sometimes it's at noon. And so you kind of already see how Reclaim's kind of taking that time policy that we built and sort of, making decisions based on your current availability, kind of where we can put the events. A really nice thing about the flexibility we have in our system, and this is pretty unique to Reclaim, there's really nothing else out there that does this, is you can also tell Reclaim, I don't want to eat lunch at 11:30. I want to eat it at like 3:50 or 1:15, excuse me. I've got my military time there. I want to eat it at 1:15. And in a lot of other systems, right, clockwise motion, if you move this event and you're sort of like, I want this thing to happen another time, either those systems are going to fight with you and move it back to that time, or they're going to say, cool, you can move it, but now you're on your own. That thing is not going to, move if it gets overscheduled. What we do is actually treat this move as sort of an opportunity to learn a little bit more about what you want. And so for Tuesday the 5th, what we're now seeing is, hey, actually, Henry wants to eat lunch at 1:15 now. So if this thing gets overbooked, let's say I get a meeting from 1 to 1:30, it's not going to move back to 11:30. It's actually going to move to 1:30. So there's some power in kind of how we think about manual adjustments. And I'll go into this one a little bit more, but in addition to the control I just showed you there, where you can just literally move an event on your calendar and Reclaim will respond, we now have this very cool Google Workspace integration. We just launched it, about a little less than a month ago. It's relatively new. And you can add it if you're a workspace admin. You can add it for your whole company. You can also just install it for yourself. And it shows up in this same little tray over here. And if I click on the lunch habit, I get all these nice little controls. But I'll come back to that here in a moment because I definitely want to show you kind of one of the main things that I think folks that are brand new to Reclaim or have only been using it for a bit kind of tend to not immediately realize. And that's how we think about availability. So you may have noticed, if you've used the product a little bit, these shield emojis. Right here is a good example of one. You've got this shield emoji, and then you see this free emoji here. And you see the same thing on Morning Catch-Up. There's actually one that has a shield and one that has free. So what does that mean? Well, there's this signal that most people don't use on the calendar, partly because it's not really practical to use it in the way that Reclaim uses it. It would take you a lot of time, and you'd probably have to be staring at your calendar all day to do it. There's a signal called free and busy events. And if you've used calendars for a long time, you might have seen it in the past, but you might not have kind of used it. Probably the most obvious place where you'll see it show up is if you create an all-day event. Typically in Google, those things will default to free. And what free events do, as the title might suggest, is they show your availability as free. So the event is there, but it's not really there from the perspective of Calendly or if someone uses Find a Time. And Reclaim uses these signals really heavily when it comes to your habits and your tasks. So for habits, what we're doing is we're actually looking at the day and we're saying, okay, well, Henry told us that he wants to eat lunch sometime between 11 and 2 p.m. and he wants a minimum of 25 minutes and a maximum of 50 minutes. And he, we're looking at his day, we're looking at that time range, and we're sort of trying to determine how many opportunities does Henry have to eat lunch, right? If something were to come up and overbook this thing, could we move the lunch to a better time? And in the case of Monday, we're looking at it and we're like, actually, you're pretty compressed. Like you've got this meeting at 1 o'clock, you've got this other thing at 11:30, you've got some time to decompress. I don't really feel good about not marking this thing as busy. And what that means is that other people will actually see this as defended, and they'll also see this nifty little description, assuming you've set your privacy to this level, where we kind of signal to your colleagues like, hey, this is kind of Henry's last, opportunity to do this thing. So please don't overbook it. If you look at lunch on Tuesday, it's marked as free time because we're looking at the day and we're like, you've actually got a whole hour here where you could eat lunch. You've got some more wiggle room between 1 and 2 p.m. And so we don't really feel a need to mark this as busy just yet. On Wednesday, that nifty feature that I mentioned earlier, we've got a team lunch on Wednesday. And so Reclaim said, hey, you don't really need lunch that day because I see this word, so I'll just skip it. And what this means in practice is if my colleagues, and kind of keep an eye on the calendar here, especially like these entries that have this free emoji on it, if I use this find a time feature, you'll notice that there's actually quite a bit of availability here that doesn't kind of show immediately when you're looking at the calendar. And that's really one of the most powerful parts of Reclaim is, we're not just going to go and battleship out your entire calendar, which I think for a lot of people with really busy schedules, especially in management roles or roles where they have to meet with people often, it's just not feasible, right? You don't want to like have your entire calendar blocked out because setting aside whether that's the right thing to do, it creates more work for you, right? People will hit you up and say, hey, I can't find any time on your calendar. Can you move this thing? Can you move that thing? And it almost kind of defeats the purpose of really having an assistant to help you manage your calendar. And so we really think of free and busy as these powerful ways to express your availability and give you flexibility while still making sure that we're not going to sacrifice those routines that really matter to you, right? So again, this is kind of another way that we kind of give you that flexibility as a product. So that's kind of, I'd say most of the core concepts. So just to review, right? Flexibility around moving events. You can make manual changes to these events. You're not locked into the things that Reclaim has blocked on your calendar. You can kind of move them to different times. You can delete them. You can skip them for the day. I'll show you some of those controls and how they show up in the Google Calendar add-on and in our planner here in a second. You can prioritize them. You can stack rank them and sort of make decisions about which routines are most important. And I'll show you how that works for tasks here in just a second. And then you get flexibility over how things appear to other people, as well as kind of whether they show as free or busy, right? And that's all kind of happening behind the scenes, and Reclaim sort of making those determinations based on your needs. Before I move on to showing you tasks and showing you some of the controls and integrations there, I'll just say that the setting that I mentioned earlier around time defense, that's really about this sort of free busy control that I mentioned. So we give you a range of controls here. If you decide that, look, lunch should always be busy, I don't ever want to risk the possibility that it's going to get overbooked by something, you can set it to that. If you're like, hey, I kind of want it to be really defensive, but not necessarily always busy, you can pick this most defensive. And so we give you a lot of different options. In this case, I'm clearly not prioritizing my lunch enough because it's marked as least defensive. So that's kind of habits in a nutshell. And really more than habits, it's kind of, this is really the platform kind of in a nutshell in terms of how we think about time blocking. I'll move into the planner next, and this is a good way to start showing you some of the controls that we give you for your habits and for your tasks. So just as like a quick example, if I want to just start my morning catch up right now, if I was like, hey, there's this EMEA growth strategy meeting happening right now, I'm probably going to tune out for that, or I don't really need to be listening in for that, or maybe I've already presented my part and I want to start catching up on my email. I can take this morning catch up that's currently booked at 11 and I can just hit start and it just moves to now, right? And it overlaps with the meeting. That's okay. You can actually see that because I had originally moved my morning catch up to 11:30, now we move lunch up to 11:30 because we said, hey, there's a bit more flexibility in the schedule now and we can get it a bit closer to that ideal time that you told us about. If I change my mind and I said, actually, I'm not going to do this thing right now. I turns out I need to get called up to present. I can just hit stop, and in a moment here, you'll see it'll actually return to its original place. So we give you a lot of these controls that sort of are meant to really be kind of ways to quickly make decisions about your habits and your tasks. You can also just drag and drop these things in the planner, just like you can in Google Calendar. And then there's also controls for things like rescheduling and skipping. So if I'm like, hey, I want to actually reschedule my lunch by an hour, we're going to try to find kind of the next best time for lunch. In this case, it's at 1:15. And so now we've got that there. I could always move it back if I decide I change my mind. I actually want to eat 11:15. If I say I'm actually going to skip lunch today, not going to eat today, I can just skip it, and Reclaim will say, okay, cool. We'll just skip that one for the day. If it's a habit that occurs only a few times a week, we'll try to make it up later in the week. So lots of controls from the planner, and all these same controls, I'll show you kind of how they operate inside of the workspace add-on, but they're all accessible there as well. And many of them are also accessible in our Slack integration if you haven't installed that. But I'll start kind of showing you the other really popular feature in our platform that takes kind of, takes a lot of these concepts that I mentioned in habits and applies them to your to-do list. So tasks, like really simply, and I'll show you first creating a task inside of our own product. And then I think the more interesting thing is showing you how you can create tasks in other platforms that will sync into Reclaim and use Reclaim's sort of intelligent time blocking to block the time on your calendar and actually sync the status bidirectionally. So I'll show you that here in a second, but really simply, right? Let's say I need to, get some QBR slides done. Not sure how many folks are doing QBRs, but this is around the time that many teams tend to do them. We're ending Q2 here. And let's say I need 4 hours. I can pick it during my working or personal hours, which you can set down here in settings. I'll go into that here in a little bit. I can tell Reclaim kind of how I want to chunk up the time. So maybe I'm like, I really don't want to spend any less than 2 hours on this, and I don't want to spend any more than probably 4 hours. That makes sense to me. And let's say, I don't know, we're going to do our QBR probably a couple weeks after the quarter's done. Let's say it's due on the 8th, and I'm probably not going to start it until the 1st. Whoops, actually, I'm not going to start it until the 1st, and it's going to be due on the 8th. So this is kind of a range. This is basically telling Reclaim, this is the earliest time I could envision doing this thing, or excuse me, this is the earliest date that I'd want you to actually schedule this thing, and then this is when it's due. I can add some notes to it if I'd like. I can change the privacy, but I'm just going to go ahead and save it. And in a second here, you will see that this will get scheduled. And in my case, it looks like I had some time on the 5th, and so I've got the time scheduled there to get it done. And I probably got, I think, another chunk of work somewhere in here. And so tasks are basically that, right? It's like a thing you want to get done by a certain date. If I decide, hey, I actually want to start this thing sooner, I could clear that sort of earliest starting date that I put in place, and you'll see everything will actually kind of move up even sooner. It looks like I actually now have this like literally starting right after this EMEA growth strategy meeting. And so we kind of give you a lot of controls over kind of when things get scheduled. From here, I can reschedule this task. I can add time to it. I can, if I actually did some work on it last night and I want to reflect that on the calendar, I could say, actually, I spent an hour on this and I did it, last night from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. And I actually got 2 hours done. And you'll see here in a second, we actually will log the time, but also we'll update the duration. And so we now know, we're like, hey, you already did 2 hours of the 4 hours you said you needed. So now we're going to decrement this by 2 hours. And now there's only 2 hours scheduled, right? So there's a lot of smarts behind the scenes when you're making some of these changes. If I finish it early, I could mark it as done. If I wanted to, edit it or change it or start it sooner, I've got a bunch of those controls here. While we're on kind of the topic of sort of doneness, before I go into the integrations, you've probably seen these different states for tasks if you've used the product a little bit here, and if you haven't, no problem. And I'll just kind of do a quick review of them because I think it's important to understand sort of how Reclaim thinks about when things are done, right? Because there's kind of this challenge when it comes to building a product like ours where, we want to treat the past as a record of what happened, because that's, the past is sort of what tells us what to schedule in the future. So we want to say, hey, if you've got 2 hours done, just like in this example I showed you, you needed 4 hours for this thing. You did 2 hours yesterday. You need 2 hours today, right? That kind of stands to reason, right? That's the way that our system kind of thinks of the world. And so why this matters, I think, when you're thinking about using Reclaim is kind of think of like the past as a record that you can control, right? So if I actually say, no, I actually didn't do those 2 hours, right? I changed my mind. I didn't actually log that work. I want to get those 2 hours back on the calendar. I can just hit this reschedule button. And in a second here, you'll see I go right back to having those 4 hours that were originally booked, right? So treat the past as kind of a record of what Reclaim did. And you can delete events directly from the past in Google Calendar, right? So if I said, hey, I actually said I was going to do a thing and I didn't actually do a thing. This was another task I created. In a moment here, you'll see that task will get reopened and it will get blocked out on the calendar, right? So we treat the past as kind of a record of here's what you did. And so to that end, there are kind of a few different states for tasks that they can be in. This open state is basically all tasks that are either you can see do a thing actually got rescheduled, and because it was due sooner, it got scheduled sooner. But I'll go into this here in a second. So open tasks are any tasks that are currently scheduled or tasks that are done scheduling, right? That sort of need some more input from you before we're actually going to consider them done. And so I'll show you an example of one. Here's one that's now done scheduling. Scheduled tasks are just ones that are scheduled. Tasks that are done scheduling are just tasks that are done scheduling. And then tasks marked done are tasks that you have actually checked the box on and said, these are marked done. And so if I go to my open tasks, you can see here I've got two different tasks. I've got one that is open and scheduled. This one has not started yet. I've got 4 hours left on it. And then I've got this one called do a thing that Reclaim, because this event's in the past, thinks that I'm done with, right? So I could go here and I could say, yep, I'm done. Or I could go in and say, nope, I need 2 more hours to work on this thing. And so in a second here, you will see that we're going to add 2 more hours. And you see we just added it here to do that task. But let's say I'm like, I actually do a thing is not as important as get some QBR slides done. I don't need to do that thing that urgently. I can just change the stack ranking here. And you can see when I change that stack ranking, when I move to do a thing below get some QBR slides done, even though do a thing is technically overdue, it's due sooner, it actually decided to schedule my QBR slides earlier, right? So due dates, we really think of them as a way to think about, the kind of way that we flip things from free to busy, kind of back to that point about like, showing your availability is flexible based on how far out the due date is. But stack ranking is really how you tell Reclaim, sort of like habits, like this is the most important thing I want to do. If you ever change your mind and you're like, I actually want to prioritize this stuff by due date, I don't want to use some custom stack ranking, you can click this little thing up here and it'll kind of prioritize and re-stack rank your stuff. So it's a pretty flexible system that you can work with. So that's kind of the, I'd say the core bits on tasks. I'm going to go ahead and mark our do a thing task is done. And you can see here, once it's marked as done, we're going to remove any upcoming time blocks, and we'll also move it to that marked done status. And you can see it down here. So that's kind of tasks in a nutshell. You can kind of access them over here. You can access them obviously from here, and you get a lot of the same controls that we show you in the planner. But where things really get powerful is with our integrations. So we've obviously put a lot of effort into Google Calendar as an integration, lots of effort into Slack as an integration. But where we've also placed a lot of effort is around these integrations that we have for different task managers and project management solutions. So in our free plan, you've probably seen our Google Tasks integration. You can use that as much as you like in the free plan. Google Tasks is this little task manager over here. And there's a concept of like, you add a task into this, into this little list that we create called Reclaim. You give it a due date, and there's some other parameters you can use. So for example, if I said, I need to mow the lawn and it's a personal task and I need an hour, and I say it's due by, I want to do it this weekend, July 4th weekend. In a moment here, you'll see Reclaim will pick this up and will actually sync it to the calendar. And it basically gets created in Reclaim as sort of any old task that you would create in our product. And this is really the core concept of basically all of our integrations. They're all about, essentially you give us a task that has a duration, a due date, and a valid assignee that has the integration turned on. And we will sync that task to Reclaim, and we'll try to keep the status updated between our platforms, right? So if you mark it as done in Reclaim or time gets burned down on the calendar, we try to update the statuses in those different platforms. And this gets more interesting when you start looking at some of the project management integrations that we built. Google Task Sync can take about a minute. Unfortunately, they don't have quite the responsiveness of Google Calendar's API, but in a moment here, you'll see this will get stripped out and scheduled. But I'll show you, while we're kind of waiting on that, I'll show you kind of one of our other really popular integrations, and this is for a product called Linear. We also have an integration for Jira, which I'll show you here in a second. But this kind of gives you a sense of how you can use Reclaim to block time for project work, right? Tasks across the team, whether they're assigned to you or assigned to other people. And today we have integrations with Todoist, Linear, Jira, Asana, and ClickUp, as well as Google Tasks. We're working on Trello and Monday, and then there's a variety of other integrations that we're looking at over the next couple years. But I'll just show you Linear since that's the one we use internally. And let's just say, I've actually got a thing where I need to fix important customer issue. And I, mark it as a high priority. And I'm going to assign it to myself, right? Because I've got the integration turned on, and maybe I'll add some notes. Need to make sure the erase condition is fixed, something. And I'm feeling pretty good about it here. It's already in a cycle, and we're going to treat this cycle in Linear's world. This is basically like a sprint. We're going to treat this as the due date. If I wanted to, I could also add a due date for this issue specifically, but I'm just going to go ahead and leave it as in this cycle, which has a due date of 4 days left. And then I'm going to add this Reclaim label, and I'll hit save. We have some different options. If you go back to the integration section, you can see we have options for things like if you want to do it for all estimated issues that have a due date or a cycle. I'm actually realizing I forgot to put an estimate on mine. Of course, I need an estimate. You can do it where basically we will, auto sync everything. In my case, I like to kind of, pick and choose what I sync to the calendar because there's maybe certain tasks that I don't want to have, blocking out my time. But you can kind of pick whatever works for you. This is generally the model we use for most of our integrations, where you kind of have a label that you can add that's sort of a signal that we use to sync it, or you just kind of tell us to pick up anything that has an estimate and a due date. And you can see here, this thing already got scheduled. Linear is an example of one that I think is very fast, just because they've built an integration platform that I think is really friendly to systems like ours that kind of need that real-time feedback. So if I click this open button, you'll see here I have my fix important customer issue here, and it's got the ticket title, and it actually shows that it's scheduled for today at 9 a.m. because it's due pretty soon. If I go into my planner, you can see here it's actually scheduled sooner, and part of the reason it's scheduled sooner is Reclaim will look at the due date and say, that due date is sooner. We should probably stack rank it above that QBR slides piece. Of course, if I decided that wasn't the case and I wanted my QBR slides to be done, ahead of that, I could move this up, but I won't do that for now. What's really nice is that, let's say I finish this work, I'm like, I actually did the work. Remember, the past is the record, and I move this to 6 a.m. I did the work super early in the morning. Not only do my QBR slides go back to being at 9 a.m. because now I've got time to do that, another nice thing is you will actually see that this thing is going to show that time as complete. And that's kind of part of how we work with these different products, right? So you can see I've got 1 hour worked here. It says it's tentatively done. We're not actually going to move it to the done state. But if I were to say like, yep, this is done, we're going to basically sync that status back to Reclaim. And that's a way of us saying, yep, this is for sure done. Make sure that Reclaim kind of treats it that way. And so in a moment here, you'll see this will actually get marked as done as well. The same concept more or less applies to Jira, which is probably a more popular issue tracker project management tool that you're familiar with. I'd say Jira's integration, as much as it's obviously a very popular platform, and we're huge fans of Atlassian. It's a little less kind of responsive than Linear, just because of sort of technical limitations. But generally, it's pretty easy to use. You've got kind of little buttons you can use to kind of create your issues. But let's say I'm just going to test out the Jira integration. I'm going to skip adding any description. I'm going to assign it to myself. And I'm going to give it an estimate. The nice part about Jira is you actually do have like time estimates. And so you could be very granular about what you want to say. So let's just say I'm going to say 2 hours here. And I'm going to give it a due date of Friday the 1st. And I will go ahead and create it. So with Jira's integration, it's slightly different. There's kind of a bit of kind of poking you have to do to kind of push it in there, and there is a mode in Jira where you can have all issues push in if they belong in a certain project, or if they're assigned to a certain project and they have all the required fields. But generally, I like these sort of manual push sort of ways of doing it, and so I click this schedule by a Reclaim button. And in a second here, you'll see that this will actually schedule. Unfortunately, there's no webhook support, and so sometimes you have to refresh the page to see the latest state. And it should be scheduled here. There it is. And so now I have this task that's been created over here, and in a moment you'll see it'll actually get scheduled onto my calendar. So you can kind of see there's a lot of flexibility over having these integrations, and we really kind of view this as like another way to kind of push work into the system, and make sure you get time for the things that matter. So with that, I'll pause for a second just to take a look at the Q&A. It doesn't look like there's any questions so far, and so I'll probably continue charging ahead here unless anyone has any questions. So Smart One-on-Ones are probably the next thing to show you. So everything I've talked about up till now is really about making time for your own work, right? How do I get time to, build the board slides before the end of the week, or how do I make sure that I get time for my routines every single week? But one-on-ones are really about smart one-on-ones are really about finding time with you and another person, but doing it in a way that's flexible for both of you and gives you really easy ways to reschedule automatically those one-on-ones when conflicts occur or when you need to make a change. And so here I've got 3 one-on-ones that I've set up with Ellen, Kathy, and Nizem. I'll show you how they look on the calendar, and I'll show you kind of how the reschedule stuff works here in a second. But just to give you a feel for kind of like how these things are set up. So this thing with Ellen, I've got 25 minutes weekly. Obviously, I've invited Ellen through her email. I've got, a description if I want to add it there. This would be useful for like a link to a rolling agenda or something like that. And then basically, just like habits, I have this concept of like duration and frequency. And the way we think of one-on-ones, and the way I think most people think of one-on-ones, is not like, hey, it's really important that I meet with this person on the second day of the month at 2 p.m. I mean, the time is not the important part. What's important is I meet with this person once a month, right? And so what we think of is really like we want to give you flexibility, around kind of when you meet with somebody, while not sacrificing the frequency that you meet with them. So in this case, I've got a weekly thing. You can do daily or every other week or monthly or quarterly. You can pick a start date for when you kind of want us to start doing it. And then you kind of have a couple different options for when we schedule it. So one is you can just say, look, Reclaim, I'm cool. Pick any time that's mutually available between the two of us that optimizes around my meeting hours. And my meeting hours you can find here. This is also where you set your hours for your tasks, right? This is kind of when we'll block time for your work tasks, when we'll block time for your personal tasks, and then when we'll block time for your meetings. And I'll come back to this here in a second when I go into the calendar. But if I'm really specific about when I want to meet with Ellen, and I'm like, I only want to meet with Ellen on Mondays, I could go in here and just say, Nope, like Monday is the only day I want to do this. Or I could say Monday or Tuesday, but ideally Monday, right? And so there's a lot of flexibility over kind of how these things get scheduled. I'm going to leave it at any time with mutual availability. And then I just give it the ideal day and time, right? Like ideally, if it's available, I'd like to meet with Ellen on Monday at 8 a.m. And generally, we're going to pull in these time policies. If you go to your detected one-on-ones here, we don't have any ones detected on here, but generally it's going to use whatever kind of the closest fit to the time policy you already had on the one-on-one when it was picked up by our system. And so if you go into this detected list and you kind of see these areas where you can review it, you'll probably find that whatever we're suggesting is pretty close to what you were already doing with your one-on-one. It's just giving you more flexibility. And then, yeah, you can add things like video conferencing and a location. I mean, pretty standard stuff. But if we go into Google Calendar, you can see here I have these 3 meetings, right? I've got this meeting with Ellen, I've got this meeting with Nizam, I've got this meeting with Kathy. They're all batched around Thursday, and that's partly because of my availability, and it's also partly because I've sort of organized my smart one-on-ones that way. And what's really powerful about one-on-ones is that you're not locked into these times, right? If you're like, hey, I don't really like where this is scheduled and you want to reschedule it, you have these nice little links here you can use to reschedule and skip. Another thing you can do is you can use our Google Calendar add-on. And if you click here, you'll see you have these options to do things like, reschedule this meeting. And I can pick another day, another time, another week. I can skip it entirely if I want, and it'll tell me kind of, okay, here's when the next one is going to be scheduled. And you can tell us whether you want to do that or not. So you get these controls, and these are exposed not only to you but to the attendee as well, and so they can make these decisions too. And so this really just helps with like limiting the amount of back and forth that you have to go through to reschedule stuff. But just the simplest example, setting aside whether somebody declines this thing and we reschedule it, or they click the reschedule button or whatever it might be. The other really powerful thing is, let's just say I'm going to Hawaii. I'm going to go to Hawaii and I blocked this time out. Whoops, I blocked this time out on my calendar and I'm gone on Thursday, right? My calendar is now busy. And what you're going to see here in a second, and we respond within about 15 seconds to any change on the calendar, is that these meetings are actually going to reschedule. And one thing to note is they're not going to reschedule. You might think they're going to reschedule to Friday or maybe to Wednesday, but they're actually not. They're not going to reschedule to Wednesday because I've made Wednesday a no meetings day for me. And this is the kind of thing you can do with meeting hours, right? You can say, look, this day is just not a day that I want to have meetings, and Reclaim will respect that and only schedule meetings on Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. And you can see here, these actually got rescheduled. Interestingly, because my calendar was pretty blocked out, Friday was when all of our stuff got moved to. And you can kind of see how we're kind of treating these different commitments differently. And so this is really just kind of an example of how you can use sort of smart one-on-ones to not only get flexibility out of your meetings, but also give yourself kind of options when let's say you go on vacation, you just want to block out your time. You can do that without having to worry about rescheduling those meetings. Last couple things I'll show you before we kind of wrap up here and pause for any questions is calendar sync. This is probably a pretty popular universal feature. I won't spend too much time on it, but just so folks are kind of aware of how to use it well. Calendar sync is really solving, it was one of our first features that we ever launched, and it's really solving this problem around blocking time across calendars, right? So if you're, a person who has a personal calendar and a work calendar, as many people do, and maybe you keep your personal events on your personal calendar, your doctor's appointments and things like that, Reclaim makes sure that those things get blocked out on your calendar, on your work calendar, or any other calendar, and also gives you flexibility over how they appear to other people. And so in this case, I have a family calendar that's syncing to my work calendar. I can create a new sync that will kind of follow the same pattern. I can show you that here in a second. I can tell Reclaim what kind of category it is. This is going to determine sort of the color and how they show up to other people. So if it's a work calendar, you'll see these kind of privacy options change and some of the colors change. You can choose a single color if you just want to like let everything be green or let everything be yellow, that kind of thing. And then visibility, and this is a really important piece of kind of how you think about calendar sync. So, we're big believers that giving your colleagues more context on your calendar saves you time. If you just put down events as busy all the time, like, yes, that might give you the most privacy, but the downside is it gives nobody any context. And so people are more likely to overbook things because they just don't know what busy means. Busy could mean meeting. It could mean really important personal event. It could mean I'm just blocking out my calendar to catch up on email. And so we have a couple different options that we give you. This first one is one that's kind of my favorite, which is this personal commitment option. This basically lets you say, look, it's a personal event, but you don't really need to know what personal event is. You don't need to know that it's a job interview. You can choose busy if you want to do busy. You can pick event details where it's sort of like private to you with full details, or you can go full, event details for you and people with access. Otherwise, it'll show as busy to them. The way this shows up on the calendar is like this. You'll see this kind of personal commitment block that's coming from my family calendar. In this case, I actually don't have this calendar shared here, so I can't actually see the source event from this account. But that's okay, because if I use the Google Calendar workspace extension, you can see here that I have this personal commitment, but I'm seeing on this side all the details of that thing. Right, so I can see the title of it, I can see which calendar it came from, and I can even go to the original event or open up the settings for how it's syncing. So it's a really powerful way if you're using Calendar Sync and you're sort of curious about the kind of sort of curious about how to hide those duplicates or kind of deal with them. This is a really kind of powerful way to do that. So that's kind of Calendar Sync in a nutshell. Nothing too demystifying or hopefully mystifying, and should give you kind of a good sense of how that works. I'll very quickly kind of go through some of our settings, and then I know there are a couple questions, so I'll kind of dive into those in a moment here. The first is kind of just around task settings. So this is where you'll find lots of different settings around really the defaults for what new tasks will get. And so we've talked about all of these, so I won't go into detail on them, but this is just something to be aware of, is if you're ever looking at these defaults and thinking like, I don't really like that it always goes here or here, or that it always gives me an offset of 3 days instead of 7 days, you can modify those things. Same with visibility around your task events, and by default we always make them private. Couple other features you'll find in here are buffer time, right? Travel time before and after events. So basically anytime we detect a location, decompression time after your video conference meetings. So anytime we pick up a meeting with a video conference link, we'll add time after them. This is one feature that we're planning on making a bunch of improvements to over the next few months, including giving you the ability to set breaks between your tasks and habits as well. And so stay tuned for that. So you get some control there. This is where you can kind of, create some information about yourself, add some information about what you're using Reclaim for. This is a pretty new section in our profile area. Here's where you can set your hours, as I mentioned earlier. And then this color coding section really kind of speaks to how we think about categorizing your calendar on a regular basis based on different categories of time. So your team meetings, your solo work, your personal time, your travel time, etc. In the future, we'll give you the ability to customize these categories. And again, it's just a nice way to show your calendar at a glance and kind of understand what the categories of it are. And that's basically it as far as the product goes. I'll pause here for a second and take some of the questions, since I see some of those in there. So the first question was, can Smart One-on-Ones work with somebody who's not using Reclaim? So the answer is today, no. Today, we require that the attendee goes through a very lightweight onboarding process where they set their meeting hours, they connect their calendar, and that basically gives us all of the data that we need to make sure that we can keep those events up to date. this week, and actually over the next couple weeks, we are working on an initiative where we're going to be basically loosening that restriction up and making it possible to set up smart one-on-ones with people who don't have a Reclaim account. And to do that, we're going to probably need to, sort of bootstrap a little bit of information. But I think there's a good path forward here. So stay tuned for that. That's definitely something that we're working on. Todoist integration. There was a question for can you go through the Todoist integration? I do not have Todoist set up at the moment. That was actually something I was working on last night and got sidetracked. But I can definitely walk you through sort of the concepts in it. If you're not aware already, we have a pretty useful help doc on it, and that gives you most of what you need to know about it. I'd say that the concepts are really similar to Linear or Jira. It's basically the same concept of like, you give us a thing, you give us a due date, you put an estimate on it, you tag it, and we sync it to Reclaim, and then we try to keep the statuses up to date in both platforms. I'd say the nuance with Todoist is they don't really have quite as many concepts around categories or excuse me, not categories, sort of like estimates and due dates. Well, due dates is kind of a correspondent, but I'd say estimates is probably the biggest one. And so there are areas where we kind of have to lean on sort of natural language. And the reality is actually this is the way Todoist already does it. If you've ever used Todoist like own natural language, they will put these sort of things in brackets like this. So we try to lean into the conventions of Todoist. But generally, like, you enable the integration, you decide whether you want us to sync everything that's in particular projects, and you can use projects and sub-projects. We show you kind of the nested list in our integration settings. And then you can schedule them based on just ones that have the Reclaim label. So we'll auto create a Reclaim label that you can tag on your tasks. We also have a Reclaim personal label if you wanted to use your personal hours. And then all tasks, which would basically be like any tasks that are in this project that have an estimate and a due date, we're gonna sync them. And then, yeah, as you're sort of thinking about estimating time, you kind of have these like natural language bits. So you can do things like get board slides done, open brackets, 2 hours, right? Or 2H, or 4D if it's 4 days. And so that's kind of how you do the estimation side of it. If you don't give it an estimate, it's just going to use the default duration that you set here. So 2 hours, right? So if your default's 1 hour or 30 minutes or something like that, it'll just give you that time if it doesn't see an estimate. And then, as I said, kind of personal versus work. You can do this a couple different ways. You can give it a type personal or type work, which is basically how we do it in Google Tasks, or you can use a Reclaim personal tag on an item in Todoist. That tag gets created for you when you set up the integration. And then similarly, if you want to get really granular about your not before dates, like, hey, this thing is due in a week, but I don't want to start it until Monday, you can add this not before syntax. And so, I'd say the nuance is really around this sort of inline syntax. That's what makes Todoist a little different from some of the other integrations we've built. But generally, it's kind of the same concept. You mark a task as done in Todoist, and we'll mark it as done in Reclaim. You mark it as done in Reclaim, we'll mark it as done in Todoist. If you move the time to the past, we'll log the work in these comment fields here. And so that's kind of a rough kind of overview of the Todoist integration through our help docs. I apologize for not demoing it, but we'll try to get that set up for our next webinar. Are there new features, or is this just a walkthrough? There are new features. I mean, this is a very new feature, this workspace integration. This has been out for about a few weeks. This planner is a brand new feature in terms of, like, the planner itself has been around, but we've made a bunch of improvements to it over the past couple months. But yes, in general, these webinars are going to sort of be walkthroughs, and obviously I know we're meeting people at sort of different places in their Reclaim journey. There's some folks who are really familiar with the platform and are probably really hungry to just hear about what's new. And then there's probably folks who are kind of brand new to the product, and we want to make sure that we're bringing everyone into the fold. We've got a lot of really good stuff coming over the next few months, and we'll definitely make sure to always highlight those in the webinars that we build. That's basically all I have for today. Unless there's any questions, I'll maybe wait just a couple more seconds to see if anyone has any other questions. But I really appreciate everyone taking time. Well, for me this morning, but wherever you are in the world, we appreciate you taking the time, and thank you for your support and for using Reclaim. And I believe there will be a recording of this webinar that'll be sent out afterwards if folks are interested. Oh, we have another question. Looking to other calendar tools such as Cron, Amy, how would you say you stack up to them and their promises for delivering similar features? Um, I think it's a complicated question because I think that the market is sort of right now segmented into really three different categories. There are calendar tools, like actual calendar clients, and those are like VimCal and Cron, and Fantastical is kind of one of the original sort of, maybe you were a user of Sunrise before Microsoft bought them. Like that's kind of the, superhuman for calendar world. Not as interested in automation, not as interested in time blocking or integrations, very interested in sort of core calendar workflows. There are scheduling platforms like SavvyCal and Calendly, and then there are sort of automation platforms and sort of intelligent, assistant kind of platforms, which are basically like ours. And we're all sort of playing in one another's space, but I would say, at a really high level, like I think Reclaim, obviously I'm biased in this regard, but in terms of flexibility and control and sophistication over making time for your tasks and routines, I do not believe there is anything in the market right now that quite matches what we've built. In terms of calendar functionality, like core calendar functionality, go create an arbitrary meeting with somebody or do all the things that you can do with Google Calendar, but faster. Cron definitely has us beat. No way I'm going to make that argument. VimCal definitely has us beat. But that's very much by design, right? We kind of want people to be able to lean into their existing platforms, and we don't personally view it as a strategic, at least for the next, for the foreseeable future, a strategic importance to basically build out a full-fledged calendar platform ourselves. When it comes to stuff like scheduling links, that's definitely a feature that's on our near-term roadmap. We're going to be building features that allow you to kind of send scheduling links to other folks, more capabilities around blocking time for meetings. There's a lot that we're going to do that's going to reach into those other markets that we talked about. But generally, our North Star is really around like, how do we help you to make time for the things that matter? And a lot of that comes down to sort of prioritizing your time and having tools for helping you manage that time, regardless of where you are, whether you're in an integration or you're in Google Calendar or you're elsewhere. So I appreciate that question, and it's a very common one that we get asked, because obviously there's been a lot of work in this space since we started 3 years ago. Cool. Well, thanks a lot again for everyone for joining, and everyone have a great day. And again, we'll be following up with recording here. Thanks so much.